Welcome, everybody. I'm going to introduce Cath Busha, they, them, their pronouns. Cath is the Dean of Student Engagement at Clark College in Vancouver, Washington, which is just over the bridge in Portland. And again, I'll be monitoring. So Cath, feel free to take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And when we say just over the bridge, reminder for those who use the bridge, there's construction starting next week on the I-5 bridge. I want to thank OWHE for this opportunity and I guess give some background of how this webinar came to be. So 2 years ago, I was invited by OWHE to be on the WISE Women panel as part of their conference. And it was during that presentation where I sort of came out as identifying as non-binary and sort of saying, what does that mean for an organization that's had this amazing history of supporting and serving women? And what kinds of conversations can we start to have? And so the year after, I submitted a workshop and presented that last January, right before we all moved into a remote environment. And then from that workshop, they invited me to continue the conversation in a webinar. So with some caveats, this is my first, I have, like many of you, been on plenty of Zoom meetings and webinars, but this is the first one that I've had the opportunity to facilitate. So I appreciate patience. And if I go off camera, it's because of internet connection. So I just wanted to put that out. I also know that being off camera can be really good to just like do self-care. So if like you're listening in and sort of pacing around or preparing your lunch or eating it, please know you've got my full support to do that. Actually, we were just talking about, maybe there's a workshop someday of what we all do when we're off camera and how productive we really have been in an environment that allows us some flexibility while we listen in. So you've got my support for that. I also just want to acknowledge for folks in Oregon, Washington, that in the community college system, I think many of us start classes next week or the week after. Some have been delayed because of smoke and fire. So I know it's a busy time. And I appreciate you doing this. And I guess just to acknowledge that it's been, for a while when someone say, how are you doing? I'd say, well, pandemic good, right? Like as good as sort of one can be. And recognizing that many of us also have found some real gifts in that time. But I would say that the smoke and the fire has impacted many folks directly and indirectly. And it's been very challenging. So I just wanted to also acknowledge that. And as I'm listening to my voice, I'm a little bit nervous. And so I once had a colleague when I taught middle school say, nervous just means you care a lot. And so I do care a lot about inclusion in organizations and stories as a way to connect. And so that's a little bit of our framework for today. So I'm going to share my screen and pull this up. All right. So this is the title of how do non-binary people fit within a women's organization. And the thing I'll cover is a little bit of non-binary 101, which is going to be primarily me sharing my story. My story is not universal and is not everyone's story. It's just one story of how I came to this identity. And there are pieces in there that may be useful for other people to understand and hear. And so let me shrink that down. When I submitted this workshop to OWHE, it was last probably December. And at the time, their mission statement said to facilitate meaningful connection, personal growth, professional advancement, and systemic change for all Oregon women in higher ed. And then after I submitted my proposal right before the workshop happened, they changed their mission to facilitate meaningful connection, personal growth, professional advancement, systemic change for all Oregon women with an X and non-binary people in higher ed. And so this was like, took some thunder out of my presentation because I thought, well, they've already done it, which is great. But actually what I really appreciate about OWHE is they do their work while they're learning forward. And so I think this conversation is in that spirit still. So some basic terms, and again, all of this could be full day presentations. And so I just want to acknowledge that too, that it's going to be very abbreviated. And if there are things that are new, I encourage you to Google them. And OWHE said they will share these slides out if you registered for today. So you'll get a copy. So when I'm using non-binary, what I'm meaning is somebody whose gender identity, how they self-identify, falls outside a traditional binary paradigm. And you can see that abbreviated MB or NB spelled out. We'll may use the word sex, and typically that refers to biology. And then gender is the construction around it. And again, I know I've got folks on this webinar that teach these things, that have these identities, and each of these we could have a much bigger conversation, but I just wanted some beginning framework for folks that are newer. So let's see, I've got, oops. There we go. Sorry, something got blocked out at the top there, at least on my copy, but it says, I believe it says non-binary is limitless. And so it was last January that Janelle Monáe came out as non-binary. And I remember some of the memes going around saying, that that femmes can use they, that there was this notion that most folks who identify as non-binary may look like me, that have been assigned a gender at birth and their present, or a gender and sex and their presentation doesn't quite match. And we see a lot more folks taking on non-binary as a self-identity and also a political stance, really trying to break that down. But that was right before right during the conference last year, which was great. So this is for conversation. People can take themselves off mute and jump in if they'd like, or put it in the chat box. We can take some time to read there if you'd rather. But I think it's important to pause before we say, how do organizations expand? And instead look backwards and say, well, why are there organizations, groups, support systems that have been binary focused, more so focusing on women only organizations and spaces? And so what is the history there? You don't have to be a historian to answer it, but your own personal opinion or experience of why, OWHE formed a while ago, why we have groups on campuses that are for women, what has been the historic purpose of that? And it says share in the chat box, but you're also welcome to share out loud if you'd like.
So Sally mentioned the ability to speak up without being shut down by men. And then I said, women are often more at a disadvantage when seeking professional mentors for upward mobility in their jobs. And so these spaces are really nice to find other mentors. Simone mentioned giving women a platform and encouragement to close the gender and pay gap and status gap. Share experiences and create community.
Yeah. And so all of these remain important. And so how do we build organizations and expand them that maintains this kind of important focus and work and is welcoming to folks that when they see the word women, they say, I'm not sure that means me, whether it's a non-binary identity, a trans woman, or someone that doesn't identify with pronouns at all or these identities. And so that's what we want to explore today. Thanks for those comments, and keep those in your mind as we move. And so, as I said, when we say women, what do we mean? And so this was something I just found online yesterday, this idea of girl, a giggle wrapped in sunshine and glitter. That imagine for many of us, we're cringing a little. That was certainly never me as a girl. But still, we have this notion of what it means to be a woman, and then a professional woman usually has to push against the sunshine and glitter image. And then how do we expand to include more folks? And so one thing I want us to think about too is often then when we think about non-binary, we can think that it's part of a transgender umbrella. And there are lots of trans folks that may, I'll just read the quote, people can be non-binary even if they don't necessarily look the part, so to speak. Gender identity is expressed in all kinds of ways. I consider myself a non-binary trans man. I appreciate being seen as a man, but it isn't the whole picture of who I am. And so I'll say when I came out in the 90s as just queer, the push, it seemed, within the trans community in a very medical model was that you are required to go from one gender to the other, and that there really wasn't a lot of room in between. And particularly for someone that wanted medical intervention, they had to profess and prove that they were going from one to the other. And so now we've got trans men that identify with they, them, he, him pronouns and say, I'm a different kind of guy. I'm a non-binary trans man, right? And so all of these words together can start to feel confusing. So I wanted to share a little bit of how I came to identify as non-binary for myself. And so that's a picture of my mom in Atlantic City, probably circa 1970, because I came along in 71. Actually, I'm going to say that's 71 because she's looking ready to have me. And so I was born in 1971, which is 2 years before Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. So with those names, who can in the chat box or take themselves off mute, let us know what that reference is. What did these two women lead us in? Anyone know? See, our chat box is quiet. Anyone? Don't know. Surprise me. The cringe. Simone, do you want to share your cringe? And then yes, Stonewall riots and ACT UP. Thank you for including that. So for me, I'll keep it simple and say Stonewall riots. If that's newer to you, again, I think a Google to fill in the history that probably you weren't taught, just like I wasn't, and I've had to learn on my own. So this set the stage 2 years before I was born, and it was in 1970 then was the first March on Washington for, I believe at the time, just gay rights. And so I was born in 71. So this is the world that I was coming into. And so when I was 3 years old in 1974, homosexuality was removed from the DSM-2. And I often think about that, of like being born into a time when, you know, this identity was believed to be a mental illness by science and treated to try and get rid of it. And at the same time, then just a few years later, gender identity disorder, which is now called gender dysphoria, was introduced to the DSM. And for some folks, especially when it came to diagnosing children with gender identity disorder, they felt like it was this backdoor way to still getting at homosexuality, because if you had an effeminate boy who wanted, you know, to engage in playing with girls, when you asked the parents what the real fear was, they would say, I'm afraid he's homosexual, right? And so they treated the gender dysphoria, but the underlying fear for many parents was still this homosexuality. So these are some pictures of me when I was probably about 2, 3 years old. And I'd say curated in that certainly I know my topic today, and so I picked a couple that fit, but this is a pretty standard snapshot of what my mom was going for. So I had 2 brothers older than me, and then I had a younger brother come after me. So I was her only girl, and she was really committed to trying to make me be her girl. And I was pretty committed to being a tomboy without having that language. So I would say then when I was about 6 years old to hitting middle school, I remember those being called the put your shirt on years, because I would look at my brothers and my cousins who were boys, and they would have their shirts off and my chest looked like their chest. And I think, well, this seems inequitable, you know, and I have my shirt off. And I remember my mom trying to explain to me about the age of 6 or 7, why I had to put my shirt on, but they didn't. And I was like, that makes no sense. And I kept saying, but why, but why, but why? And I can see, you know, that's an early questioning of kind of this binary. And I remember her really struggling with like, well, because, you know, girls have to hide their bodies from men. And I was like, why? And so this binary starts as training that many of us get started really early. And so then hitting middle school, this would have been like the 80s. So what I remember in terms of my gender in middle school, checkered Vans the first time around. I remember wearing parachute pants. And I remember playing after school flag football. I was the only girl. It was an optional after school activity. And I'm 5'10", and I was probably, you know, pretty close to that by middle school. I was tall, I was athletic, and I was proud of it. And so therefore I was better than the boys at football. And I remember a boy calling me lesby. And I remember at the time, I didn't know what the word meant, but I knew the way it was delivered, it wasn't nice. And I can see, you know, so lesbian is about a sexual orientation, but I was not connected to anyone. It was really about my gender. It was about being a strong, athletic girl that I got called that name. And then I remember going back to school shopping in middle school. And my mom, you know, it was torture. We'd go to Kmart, and I would try to sort of head towards the boys department with my brother, and she would take me over to the girls department. And I remember coming out of a dressing room once with this floral print blouse on and sort of standing in front of her and saying, I think we can both agree this doesn't look good. And, you know, she sort of nodded, and I think we compromised on perhaps parachute pants and something else, but it was a struggle. And again, no language, no support groups, no GSA, you know, nothing like that. But this tension going on already within my family and certainly within school of my gender. And I do remember my mom telling me in middle school, I came home and I talked about something with sports. And she said, you know, if you don't let the boys win, they're not going to like you. And turns out it didn't matter to me. So then I hit high school, and I can remember in high school wearing Ocean Pacific. That was sort of the brand, and those were, you know, colorful T-shirts and shorts that were fine. And I would say still my identity at this time. I didn't have any kind of formed queer identity. If I called myself anything, I'd say I was a tomboy, an athlete. But I will say that 11th grade, I had an English teacher named Mrs. Showers, and I remember every day going to her class and being so excited about her class, and she was so passionate about teaching American literature. And turned out I was very passionate in writing long papers trying to impress her. And had you asked me in 11th grade, do you have a crush on her? I would have absolutely said no. But functionally, that's what was happening. And certainly and I became an English teacher, I think because of Mrs. Showers. I can also look at high school. And so one of the ways that I was able to support this gender identity, again, not named, but just lived, of being an athlete, was because of Title IX. So I played 4 varsity sports. You know, I worked at McDonald's. I was really busy. I was literary magazine editor. I had a good GPA. And now I look back and I see that was repression. My peers were dating and exploring those kinds of things. And that wasn't even on my radar because I was in Amish country, Pennsylvania, and it wasn't safe to even explore those things. And I remember not getting asked to prom, and my friends were like devastated on my behalf. And I was like, I'm so relieved because I didn't have money to buy a gown. And oh my goodness, I did not want to wear a gown. And so this was my gender sort of through high school. And there's one of my senior class pictures. That's a term. So then I move on to college, and thanks to Title IX, which was, also from the 70s, I had a partial athletic scholarship that paid for school, and then I had Pell for the rest. And I didn't start dating really until I turned 21, no surprise there. So going out, being able to drink. And I remember a guy asked me out to go see Fried Green Tomatoes. And if you're not familiar with the film and you don't know the reference, it'd be worth a watch or read the book. But it's definitely women-centric. And I remember like sitting in the theater with him, and I was so transfixed by the movie, and he was not interested in the movie at all. And I remember, I think it was one of the first times I was like, something's not lining up here, that I was starting to realize there might be more to my sexuality and gender than I was conscious of. And it was starting to emerge. Again, my friends were really into like dating, and this was an attempt with a guy, and I would rather spend time with my friends than go on dates. So I graduated. I'm a first generation college student. I went to local public college. So that's that picture. And then the picture at the top is me teaching. I taught middle school language arts. And I will say that when I started teaching, I got rid of my tomboy clothes, and I realized like I conflated professional means I have to dress up, and dress up as someone assigned female at birth means dresses and skirts and blouses and things that I felt so uncomfortable in. It's nothing I had ever worn before. But I knew that that's what was required to be read as a professional. So those middle school years, and this would have been like the mid 90s, 1993. So to just frame it for historical purposes, Brandon Tina was murdered. Boys Don't Cry movie, if you've seen it. And if you haven't, it's a difficult story in film. So I'll just give that heads up. But I remember that impacting me, not because I had empathy or compassion for Brandon Tina. I remember hearing it in the news. And because of the conservative area that I grew up in, I remember having this reaction. And now in hindsight, I think also really starting to push down my own gender stuff. I remember thinking like, well, that's what happens when you go against God. And that's really hard to say out loud now, almost 20 years later. But that's how I felt. And I think I was fearful of what it means to push against gender and to see what society does for folks when they do. In 1994, I had some of my students had their stories published in a national book called Random Acts of Kindness. And my principal thought it would be great to introduce this book to our community. And he invited religious leaders, and he had me speak to this religious community. And this was a very conservative area. And I remember standing in front of these religious folks with my big hair and my dress on. And I felt it was such a difficult morning because I remember thinking, if you really knew who I was. So by 94, I was beginning to question my sexual orientation to myself. I didn't talk to anyone, and this was pre-internet. But I remember looking out at this crowd who was so pleased with this book and the work that I did with the students. And in that time period, this was focused on the family. This was a really hostile time for LGBT folks. I remember thinking, like, how do I reconcile what is starting to emerge from me and the community I'm in, and how do I keep my job, and how do I take care of my students? And so I ended up leaving teaching just after 4 years because at the age of 26, I wasn't ready to try to put all that together, and there wasn't, professional or social support to do it. So for time frame 97, Ellen comes out, and then right after that, I came out as well. One of the things that happened in my last year of teaching in that middle school, so only other teachers and administrators had access to my faculty mailbox. And once a week, someone was putting women's clothing catalogs into my faculty mailbox. Because after I came out in 97, I had one more year of teaching, and I started to dress more like I wanted to, which was like khaki pants and button-down shirts. So no more dresses. I cut my hair. And so that last year that I taught school, I began to be more of who I wanted to be and who I was. And I started to get these not so subtle messages of like, it wasn't okay. So then I did what a lot of folks do. I only ever wanted to be a teacher. I wasn't sure what to do next. So I went to grad school. I attended Temple University in Philly just for a couple of years. I worked on a master's of journalism that luckily I didn't finish. And I only say that because of, the state of journalists now. But that's when I moved away from home and I came out in a big city. I had my first love. And it was the first time somebody labeled me Butch. I wasn't familiar with the word, but kind of like being called Leslie. I remember when someone said, well, you're a Butch, I had this like negative reaction to it and I didn't like it. And so that was one of those gendered moments as well. I made the decision that year to move to Tucson. That's like a whole separate presentation of how I came to that decision. But in arriving to Tucson, that would have been late 80s, like 98. I think that was about the year. Yeah, 97, 98. Within a couple of weeks, Matthew Shepard was murdered, the Wyoming white gay man. And that was sort of my coming out into Tucson community as well. Just this like, what does it mean to be queer and visible in the United States? And Matthew Shepard was small and feminine and was targeted because of it. So I ended up, when I got to Tucson, I started volunteering at a nonprofit called Wingspan, which was an LGBT community center. So it was amazing to me to go in 1 year from like a pretty closeted school teacher in Amish country to a year later, I was facilitating support groups for queer youth coming out. And again, like late 90s. And I ended up working at Wingspan for 10 years. So I started as a volunteer and got a paid position and then was part of helping the organization grow. So the picture on the left, there's a drag queen and I am the king with the hat. And then in the next picture, that's me. And these are from a grant I wrote to the CDC to do tobacco cessation for LGBT people. And every year we'd have a Take Your Last Drag show. And I remember being so delighted using, I think it was George Bush's time, maybe it was Clinton, but using federal funds to like host a drag show at a queer center on the border, and just really getting into the politics of gender, of class, of all these things and using money to perpetuate, in my mind, what was good. So as I mentioned, I worked at Wingspan for 10 years. I'd say my second love is really where I began to find language for what I was experiencing. She was a lawyer and she wrote a paper in law school called The Gender Box, and I read it. And in her reference section, she referenced Leslie Feinberg and Kate Bornstein, and these were new names to me. I'd never heard them. And I read Stone Butch Blues, and like a lot of folks my age, that was like the book. And so I read it, and I was like, oh, other people have this struggle in the bathroom. Other people gendered like me. Other people gendered like me don't want to wear dresses no matter what. Other people gendered like me. It was the first time that I saw myself reflected, a working class background, all these things in a book. So from there, I started to explore my gender. Like, what does it mean to have this gender during this time? And so I attended a support group called Desert Boys. And they said that they were a group for anyone assigned female at birth who didn't feel like that fully captured who they were. And when I went to the group, what I found is it was trans men, very much about how and where to get testosterone, how to get legal name changes. And this is a conservative state of Arizona in the 90s. And so it totally made sense to have that space. But as I sat there, I was like, I don't think this is my story. Because I heard them talk about how they always knew they were a guy. And I was like, I don't feel like a woman, but I don't think I'm a guy. And I don't have language, for what is this thing? And so I had a really negative experience with Desert Boys. In fact, one of the guys, I came to the group like 3 times and someone turned to me and said, well, what brings you here? You've been coming, but you haven't been talking. And I said just what I said now. I'm not really a woman, but I don't want to be a guy. And so I'm not really sure. Maybe I'm Butch. And I kind of said it like that. And someone laughed and they said, you're not Butch. When I was a lesbian, I was Butch. And then they went on to sort of tell me how I should identify. And then someone said, if people see you as a guy, eventually you're going to become a guy. So you should just accept it now. So it was also this very confusing experience to go into a space that was supposed to be helpful that wasn't. So again, the importance of spaces that are clear about who they're for. And so from there, then I said, well, I can't be alone. So I formed a group called Gender Outlaws, and it was more in Kate Bornstein's line. And I was like, for those of us whose gender is bigger or outside of the binary, again, this was 20 years ago, and like 45 people came to the first meeting. And I was like, okay, there's something here. So this movement's been happening for a long time. The language is just catching up, but we've been at this. And so this is a picture from 8 years ago. That's me with my newborn son, just a couple hours old. And so it kind of catches us up to where we are now. I moved from Tucson to Boulder. I was the executive director of the LGBT center there. I taught and worked at Chemeketa and Salem. Chemeketa, I know there's some folks on the meeting today. And then I worked at Lewis and Clark College, and now I'm in Vancouver. So I've been working my way up I-5 North. And so I will say landing professionally in higher ed I was able to bring together my identity and my experience and this framework that I hadn't had before. So when I arrived in higher ed, typically what I would say is, you know, when I would get gendered as a man, my response would be, I'm a woman and a woman can look many different ways. And then when I started to work at Lewis and Clark College, I started to meet students who were saying I'm non-binary and they were using the pronoun they, and some had taken, you know, medical interventions or hormone interventions, but many hadn't. And I was like, my mind was blown and I just dove deep into learning. And so it's a good reminder for all of us to listen to our students and that they can teach us things not just about their lives, but our own. So I have students at Lewis and Clark to thank for really finding finally an identity in a space that makes sense to me. And then I have a note in there too that parenthood was sort of a difficult thing. I didn't feel when I saw images of like what a mother is, I was like, that doesn't quite feel like me as well. So to the present, I dropped the Y from my name and I came out as non-binary a couple years ago. In August 2018, I had gender affirming top surgery that was covered by insurance. I needed the diagnosis of gender dysphoria to have that. And I will say I had to do a lot of personal work because for a long time, my framework around gender and sex was, there's not something wrong with me. There's something wrong with sort of a culture that forces the binary. And when I finally came to peace with my gender identity, I realized like, this is something I want, but I don't want the rest. And that now is covered, you know, under insurance as a valid reason for surgery. And I didn't feel awful prior to surgery. That also was what I thought was needed in the 90s was you were supposed to tell, you know, if you don't have this, you are suicidal. And for many folks, that is how life-threatening it can feel when their gender is not affirmed. I didn't feel that kind of awful, but I feel so much better. And I can say now I have, if someone were to say, okay, well, now your body's going to go back to the way it was, I would feel awful, right? So I sort of made peace with a body that I didn't know I had options for because the options weren't there, and now they are. So my kiddo calls me Fati, and they use they pronouns for me, and it's their norm very much. So it kind of catches you up on me and how one person who's turning 50, you know, next year came to this identity, and someone who really loves and wants to support OWHE as well. So I want to pause there for a second because I've been doing like East Coast style talk at you, and I guess just check in with questions or comments of anything up to this point, because I do want to get into some organizational examples of what organizations have done to create welcome for folks like me and other folks. Any comments or questions? The name of the book that I read was called Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg. And I actually had this really profound. I worked in Tucson. I got invited to speak on a panel at Maricopa Community College, and I showed up, and Leslie Feinberg was one of the panelists, and I was like, oh my God. So I just got to like sit next to Leslie Feinberg on a panel, and it was amazing. Yeah, and it's a great read. It's a great book, well written. That is German, yes. Which my kiddo says, I like Fati, it's going to work well everywhere but Germany. But if we go to Germany, people are going to think you're my dad. It's going to be confusing. And I got German heritage, and so it was some way to try and capture a piece of that. So we still have folks, you know, that have a notion of trans as needing medical, legal, social interventions. And the truth is that that doesn't work anymore. And it never really did work. There are lots of non-binary trans folks that have surgery and some don't, have different kinds of surgery. Some do hormones, some don't. Legal name change, legal gender change, you know, and as a bonus, Oregon in 2017 and Washington followed right after. You can have a non-binary identifier on your driver's license now. And all you need to do is just say, I would like this. You don't need a letter from a doctor. There's no diagnosis required. And so some people do it as a political statement as well. Because again, like, if you think of it, why does our driver's license need to have a gender? Like, there's a lot that we gender that really doesn't need it. So I think that's also, we may finish this webinar with more questions and answers. And that would be one of my goals, is that you start to pay attention to all the things that are so heavily gendered in our world and start to be like, why? Why is this something that's gendered? Let's see. So does OWHE include me, you know, and folks like me? Yeah.
Looks like we have a couple other comments.
Okay.
Just real quick before we move forward.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, Vanessa writes, your parent comments earlier, although I'm not a parent, I realized that when I came out and started to ID as non-binary, people would refer to me as my dog's mom, and it's been so hard to figure out what to do or say about that.
Yeah, it's real.
Yeah. back to what you said too, of just like gendering things that don't always necessarily need to be gendered. And then Becky wrote, thanks for sharing the picture of your son. My trans nephew is uncertain as to whether he has chosen him, wants to have a biological child one day.
Okay.
And Simone wrote, I agree, we need to do away with gender specific stuff. My oldest child is non-binary and people don't understand that they aren't trans or gay. They are just not of a binary gender. Seems simple to me, but not to the rest of society.
Yeah, I mean, my standard reply for children now. So like if I'm with my kiddo and someone's like, is that your dad or is that your mom? Because my voice is, softer and higher, but I have this, I'm 5'10" and I have this physical presentation. And so, I will usually intervene from there and I'll say, it's amazing. I am the best of both. And gender, like I get to be the best of like men and women, a father and mother. Isn't that awesome? And they're like, yeah. So if we lead children and we give them examples, but I recognize it's still a form of the binary. I mean, we have to kind of go through it to get out of it at some point, but at least see children questioning and being more open.
Yeah. I would say like I've had to start teaching my son this vocabulary without knowing, like without feeling as though like I am specialized enough to do it. But like my 3-year-old really likes to gender identify people and be like, look, mom, there's a boy. And I'm like, I don't really know. Sometimes, I don't know. And so I'm like starting to have to reinforce they, them, theirs. And that's like a new vocabulary word for him, and having to learn how to like apply that word when kids get so excited about this new thing that they know how to do, which is gender people.
Yeah. And I can say, as a parent who's white, who has a white child, worked on issues of race with him in this Portland metro and had similar experience of where he'd be out and we'd be talking about race at home. He'd be like, there's a black man. And I was like, okay, I want him to see race, right? Like this is, but it feels like cringy to be like, and very concrete, like they're trying to like grasp the words we've given them.
Yes.
I appreciate the parent struggle of how do we do this? I can say now that he's 8 and we've been at this language for a while, he'll say things like, oh, well, I was talking to that kid over there and the person who I assumed to be their dad. And I'm like, wow, like how it works. But it takes a constant practice on both sides. Yeah.
Yeah.
In the next 10 minutes or so, I did research to find out, what are some higher ed, student affairs, in some cases, places where we see some attempts at how we think outside this binary. And so the NCAA, this is how they have recommendations for students who identify who are not taking hormones, right? Like as soon as you get into the hormone thing, then people worry about athletic advantage, particularly for trans masculine folks. But what the NCAA says, a student who identifies as gender fluid, gender queer, non-binary, agender, or another gender outside the gender binary, not taking hormones, may participate in sex-separated sports activities in accordance with the individual's assigned birth sex. So this is how the NCAA has handled it. Put that out there. To that, then I found this in Stanford newspaper where they have a track and field student. I won't read the whole thing, but this student had a great day. What's their sport? I'm going to say it's probably shot put if they launched a 4-kilogram weight. And so they were participating on probably the women's track and field team, and over were gendered as a woman. And for the student athlete, it hurt because they don't identify as a woman. They identify as they, non-binary, meaning that there should be space for them, but still, particularly in college sports and professional sports, we see this divide. I mean, I remember being in high school and having the battle of like, we were the girls basketball team and the equivalent team was the men's basketball team in high school, right? They didn't call them boys, they called them men's, or they were basketball and we were girls basketball, right? Like, anyway, so how do you make room when we've got these rigid gendered sports and other activities that we've framed around? So this is a group out of UNC, and they call themselves Women of Worth, and kind of to that encouragement as you have gender-based organizations that you're explicit about how you're defining the gender. So what they say is they spell women with an X to acknowledge a history of exclusion in many second wave feminist organizations, and to signal welcome of all women identified individuals, regardless of assigned sex at birth. So it's about self-identity. And they go on then to do some history. During the 70s, some women's organizations sought to create linguistic marker of women's independence from men by changing the spelling to woman with a Y. I remember that time very much. They insisted, though, that biologically essentialist understanding of femininity and didn't include trans women as real women, right? So we are for women, but not trans women, was a marker of the 90s and the early aughts. And so now groups are saying women is however one wants to self-identify in that way. And it doesn't matter what your assigned sex at birth was or what you haven't had to complete interventions now to earn that. You just get to pick it. And then this is out of University of San Francisco. They have a women of color leadership group, and same when they explain women with an X. We understand there's no single story when it comes to being a woman, and we recognize the systemic oppression of marginalized genders. Our use of X in women demonstrates our intentional effort to recognize there are also feminine identified non-binary genderqueer people that experience the effects of sexism and genderism. We welcome all women of color, including those who identify as trans, non-binary, genderqueer. The X asserts not everyone identifies with the gender binary. This allows us to collectively consider the struggle and resilience of those in our communities, again with an S, that identify as trans, non-binary, genderqueer. And I'm realizing I'm reading woman with an X as women. I don't know if anyone else has heard different pronunciations of that word. This word here. We'll go with that for today, and I'm open for feedback. So I found this, and I thought it was helpful, just framework going forward as you're, trying to bring in people to your conference or employment, as you're recruiting. So instead of looking for proposals from women and non-binary people, you might say we're looking for proposals from creators with underrepresented genders. This includes cis women, cis being your assigned birth that sex matches your gender, trans women, trans men, non-binary people, and those who are otherwise marginalized. And then be specific about who's included in your mission. So, as a trans non-binary person, when you see you're explicitly included, it can alleviate a huge amount of worry about participating in social situations. So if your initiative is just for women, then be specific that includes trans women. If it's for all marginalized genders, then be specific there. And know that, trans men with facial hair and chest hair, and can they be in an OWHE space and be welcomed? In the same way, and I can say yes, that OWHE's made incredible strides to be really inclusive and welcoming, and that, but to be explicit is really be the way to go. But we do have about 10 minutes, which is decent timing for, I guess, opening it up on questions, comments, things that you had hoped we might get to that we didn't, or explicit reasons you came, or stories that you wanted to share, either from your institution or your own experience. And I've got my personal email here. Feel free after today to keep in touch with anything. Like I shared, I came to this identity and this experience through people sharing their stories. So I believe in kind of paying it forward and offering to help out in any way that I can with others that are going through things.
I have a question, if I could.
Yeah, please.
So I've been working with this student who has transitioned a bit from one year to the next. They identify non-binary. When they started as a student, they identified female, and they're describing themselves now as feeling more on the male side and moving actively in that direction, but still kind of more comfortable non-binary. They have lived as a resident in a female dorm and are interested in being a resident assistant and want to be a resident assistant, preferably in that dorm, because that's where they've built community. And this is not something that there's structure for within my institution. And it's not also anywhere where I necessarily have any power. But speaking with the student and even talking to them about how they might advocate for themselves or how I might advocate for them, or even what solutions I might suggest. It's just kind of a complex one. So I was wondering if, you or anyone else here might have some ideas on that situation.
I appreciate that you included the wisdom of the group, because you answered my one part, which would be, why do you have sex-specific residence halls? And I heard you say it is what it is, and positionally you're not in a place to necessarily challenge that. But I know many schools have done away with gender-specific housing, and it didn't lead to all the fears that everyone worried about. So let me turn it to the group. Ideas that you have from your institution, or just listening of how the student they want to remain in what's like a women's housing situation as they're transitioning. More masculine, Rebecca, did I get that right?
Yes, that is
okay. I'm going to mute and see if others have ideas.
So I work for Reed, which is a pretty liberal space, very liberal arts college experience. Our students have a very loud and big voice when it comes to changes on campus, institutional changes. Their opinions are very open. We only have 1,400 students. So what's valuable about that small liberal arts model is that like our president is very accessible, our vice president, very accessible. And so I would almost recommend, which I know this is kind of like, I don't want to add extra effort that this student would have to put forward, but taking time, because it sounds like they've already built community with the people that live there, to see if those students are open to supporting like this student's goal in advocating like this person is absolutely welcome and we would love to have them in this role. Like this is something that like we would also fully support as the recipient of that experience. And I don't know if your institution is set up that like students would be able to lend their voice, but I find that often like if the students make enough noise, change happens.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Thank you.
Any other suggestions for Rebecca? And we can expand. Are there other questions or comments or feedback or takeaways from today, things that were new or things that you disagree with?
Rebecca, does your institution have any sort of like my college has a transgender nonconforming student group on campus that's like funded through Student Senate. Does your institution have anything like that maybe like a student group could also support them in any way?
We have a one student group it's called the Gender and Sexuality Partnership Group, and so it's just kind of it's a small group as well. So I think they're still working on trying to build community for themselves and among themselves, is the feedback that I've heard. I'm at a fairly conservative religious institution, so there's a little less, there's more work to be done.
Sometimes alumni can have power in the kind of organizations you're talking about as well, because often folks, if they didn't have a coming out during college because of that environment, when they come out later, recognize maybe the challenge that the environment was and want to kind of circle back and help. So that's another place.
That's a good idea too.
Potential systems change. But I think, the data show that just the student knowing that you support them is a big deal, right? Like that they know they're not alone in this and that they've got allies. I remember it was when I worked in Colorado at the LGBT Center there. We partnered with University of Denver School of Social Work to do a study on gay-straight alliances in high schools, and this was like 15 years ago. And what the research showed was the just mere existence of a gay-straight alliance in a high school was a protective factor from suicide for students, even if they never physically went. But just knowing that like something in their school existed and they didn't even feel ready to go to it. So those kinds of markers, we're not out of that yet. Are really important, and those are the things that people look for within organizations. So sometimes we can think we don't need to signal. I had a hard conversation with a colleague last year. She did the right thing. She reached out to me directly and said, Cath, can we go for a walk? Because back when we all used to, work in person together, I'm someone that makes myself available for walks for folks that are interested and able. And that's something I like to do instead of just meeting in an office. And so I said, sure. And she said, I see this whole push to put pronouns in signatures, but I'm against it. I was like, you're against pronouns? I was trying, and it wasn't being facetious. I was like, well, what are you against? She's like, I'm not going to do it. I was like, because she's like, I don't believe in it. And I was believe in. And so I tried to explain, she's cisgender. She identifies as she. I was like, so if you put your pronouns in, like that's a factual statement about you. And what it signals to a student or another employee is that you're aware that, that for them, this is an organization, an office, a department, you're a professional that is considering that that's important, that people think about pronouns and identity. It's not forcing you to change anything. She's like, well, I refuse, and I will never use they for you. Okay. So I was grateful for the one-on-one talk. And I was also like, I have to be the one that had this talk with you. And I did. But I know that that's still among our colleagues as well. And so that we've got folks that refuse. And so under the old version of Title IX, we're able to have some leverage of conversations when we had instructors that refused to use correct pronouns. Title IX was expanded to include, but in the new interpretations, it's been more pulled back. So we know that there's still resistance to even just simple gestures of affirmation for students and employees at our institution. Hi, Sharon.
Hi. I have a question for you more related to staff and faculty working at institutions. So, I'm at Lewis and Clark in the graduate school, and we're lucky there to have as a resource the Transactive project, which is fabulous. Not everyone has a resource like that. And even at Lewis and Clark, not all faculty and staff are comfortable using the resources there. And I have had staff in particular come to me and talk with me about where they are in exploring their own identity and where their professional safe spaces are. And we've actually talked specifically about OWHE and whether the organization is a safe space. Could you talk a little bit about just professionally where people could find those safe places, the places for professional development, all of those things, if they're not comfortable connecting with OWHE or don't know of where those spaces or organizations might be?
So, is there a list that exists of these are organizations within higher ed that are affirming and welcoming of expansive gender?
Yeah, I guess some of that, and just anywhere where people could find more of a sense of inclusive community. I'm guessing, but I don't know, maybe NASPA, there may be other organizations. And I don't know, just, I guess, basically, where can people find support as professionals in higher education who are in various stages of looking at a gender identity?
Yeah, I'm thinking NASPA does. I mean, a lot of the student affairs professional organizations have kind of working groups or subcommittees, or at the conferences, caucuses. Like, I was really impressed with OWHE's conference in January. There was a women of color only dinner, and then also a queer only dinner. And I know politically those have always been, difficult for people to understand who don't have those identities. Why are we being exclusionary? And they did such a good job of framing why we're being exclusionary, and why the space is important. But in terms of how does one go about finding out when it's not explicit? I think that's the intention here of how do we be more explicit? And I don't know that a list exists, but it's a good question. And, I'm someone that still, when I see like a rainbow flag on a car, it's like a leftover 90s signal from Amish country, where I came out, I'm like, yay, there's these things that we still look for that are important. And I would argue now are maybe more important than ever. So of really being explicit in our welcome and in our strong statements as organizations. And gender is one of those that, it requires educating people while you do it, right? So sometimes it's people just put the pronouns up but don't understand why. And so as your organization educating of like what the reasons are and how it feels to be mispronounced, those sorts of things. And like, would anyone, when you sort of appeal to someone's heart, you can lead to organizational change that way. Like, I don't think you intend to hurt someone, but when you refuse to use their pronoun, that's what you're doing. So I see people signing off. I know we've got Zoom commutes to another meeting, perhaps. I hope your Friday's wrapping up, but I am available after today. I do think the slides will go out. I hope it just led to some thinking and some awareness. I like to finish classes with homework. And so, to the extent that you can just pay attention for the next week to gender and what things are gendered that probably don't really need to be. And if you've got kiddos in your life, having that conversation with them and how do they identify? If you've never asked them, it could be a fascinating conversation. I talked to my child, he's like, I'm a boy who wears pink, he's really like understands the binary and is playing with it at the same time. But he's like, I am a boy. I was like, okay. So those are fun conversations to have. Thank you all so much for this time. Do you have a OWHE plug or anything you want folks to know about the organization before we officially sign off?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. So we are getting ready to send out communications about registering for our upcoming conference. As you can imagine, it's going to be hosted virtually. And we're really excited. We're also going to be sending out surveys soon for you all to kind of give us some feedback about just structurally, how would that look and what are your opinions on how long sessions should be and what times work for you. So definitely stay tuned. We'll be sending out a lot more OWHE communications shortly. You'll be hearing from us. Thank you so much, Cath. It was really great
You're welcome.
About your experience. And thank you everyone for joining. And Cath mentioned we're going to be following up and sending the slides out. The session was recorded if you want to refer back to it. But have a great weekend.
Thank you, everybody. See ya.
Thank you both.